In December 2024, Kazakhstan announced it would curtail uranium exports to safeguard domestic supply. Within days, uranium spot prices jumped 11%. Most Australians didn't notice, but in Beijing, Tokyo, and Washington, that announcement triggered urgent conversations about energy security, and all three capitals arrived at the same conclusion. Australia controls the answer. This matters to you for three reasons. First, uranium is now a strategic commodity. Governments don't just buy it, they compete for guaranteed access. Second, Australia holds the world's largest uranium reserves, but sells almost none of it in processed form. We export the raw material and forfeit the premium. Third, your superannuation is exposed. Energy security determines which economies grow and which stagnate. If Australia remains a passive supplier, we capture a fraction of the value while others industrialize on our resources. In this video, we'll examine three things. First, how uranium became a geopolitical lever, and why Australia's position is irreplaceable. Second, what the numbers reveal about global supply, demand, and the quiet race to lock in Australian output. And finally, what this means for Australia's sovereignty, economic leverage, and strategic choices going into 2026. Let's begin. To understand today's situation, we need to briefly go back. For 30 years, uranium was politically toxic in Australia. The 1970s anti-nuclear movement, combined with legitimate environmental concerns, created a political environment where uranium mining was tolerated, but barely. Successive governments approved only 3 mines: Olympic Dam in South Australia, Ranger in the Northern Territory, and later the 4 Mile Project. Meanwhile, Kazakhstan, Canada, and Namibia expanded production aggressively. By 2010, Australia held 30% of the world's uranium reserves but contributed only 20% of global supply. We had the resource. We lacked the political will to dominate the market. Then 2 things changed. First, Fukushima in 2011 temporarily collapsed uranium prices and froze nuclear expansion. Governments reconsidered. Projects stalled. But second, and more importantly, the climate debate shifted. By 2020, even environmental groups began acknowledging that baseload nuclear power might be necessary to replace coal while maintaining grid stability. Germany's disastrous exit from nuclear, forcing a return to lignite coal, became a cautionary tale. Suddenly, uranium wasn't a pariah. It was a transition fuel. And Australia, which had spent decades on the sidelines, found itself holding the most valuable hand at the table. I want you to look closely at this. Global uranium demand in 2024 sits at approximately 65,000 tons per year. By 2030, the World Nuclear Association project's demand will reach 80,000 tons, driven primarily by China, India, and a resurgence of reactor construction in Europe and North America. Current global production? Roughly 60,000 tons. We are already in deficit. The gap is being filled by secondary supplies, recycled warheads from Cold War stockpiles, downblended military inventories. But those reserves are finite, and they're nearly exhausted. What's unusual here is this. Australia produces approximately 6,000 tons of uranium per year, around 10% of global supply. But we hold 1.7 million tons of reserves, 30% of the world's total. No other country comes close. Kazakhstan has comparable production but half the reserves. Canada's reserves are declining. Now consider the buyers. China is constructing 23 reactors. It plans to triple nuclear capacity by 2035. India has 8 reactors under construction and ambitions to expand tenfold over the next 2 decades. The United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Poland, and the United Kingdom are all re-entering the nuclear market after decades of hesitation. Every one of them requires guaranteed uranium supply for the next 30 to 50 years. And every one of them is looking at Australia. This is the part most headlines miss. Uranium isn't traded on open markets like oil or wheat. It's sold through long-term contracts, 10, 20, sometimes 30-year agreements between producers and utilities. These contracts lock in supply at fixed prices, with clauses that protect both parties from volatility. Right now, those contracts are being renegotiated. and Australia holds the leverage. But we're not using it. Let's think through what happens next. If Australia maintains its current posture, mining uranium but refusing to process, enrich, or fabricate fuel, we capture royalties and export revenue, but nothing more. The premium value sits downstream. Conversion, enrichment, and fuel fabrication add 4 to 6 times the revenue per ton. Right now, that value flows to France, Russia, and increasingly China. Here's the strategic risk. China is investing heavily in uranium conversion and enrichment facilities. It's signing long-term supply agreements with Kazakhstan and Namibia, and it's acquiring equity stakes in Australian uranium projects. If China becomes the dominant processor of Australian uranium, it doesn't just control supply to its own reactors, it controls supply to Japan, South Korea, and potentially Europe. That's geopolitical leverage. Now consider the American position. The United States banned Russian uranium imports in 2024, creating an urgent need for alternative supply. Australia is the obvious partner. We share intelligence, defense commitments, and legal frameworks. But without domestic enrichment capacity, Australia remains a raw material supplier, not a strategic partner. Washington wants guaranteed access, but it also wants Australia to build sovereign fuel cycle capability so we're not dependent on third parties. That requires investment. It requires political will. And it requires accepting that uranium is no longer a moral question. It's a strategic one. Let me show you the consequences if we delay. If Australia does not expand production and processing by 2030, 3 things happen. First, uranium prices rise sharply as utilities scramble for supply. We benefit temporarily, but only as a price taker, not a price maker. Second, China locks in long-term supply from other producers, Kazakhstan, Namibia, Niger, and builds leverage over the fuel cycle. Third, Australia's strategic value to the United States diminishes. If we can't supply fuel, we're just another mining jurisdiction. But if Australia moves decisively, expands mining, builds conversion plants, and partners with allied nations on enrichment, we become indispensable. We don't just supply uranium, we guarantee energy security for the democratic world. That's leverage. That's sovereignty. So when you step back, 3 truths emerge. First, uranium is no longer a commodity. It's a strategic asset, and Australia controls more of it than any other nation. Second, global demand is rising faster than supply, and the countries that secure long-term access now will determine the energy hierarchy for the next 50 years. Third, Australia faces a choice. We can remain a passive exporter, capturing a fraction of the value while others industrialize on our resources. Or we can build sovereign capability, secure premium revenues, and become a cornerstone of allied energy security. The window to decide is closing. Here's the question I'll leave you with. Does Australia's uranium position strengthen our sovereignty? Or does selling it without processing make us dependent on foreign buyers who control the value chain? I'd welcome your perspective. Until next time.